Welcome to meeting number 43 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Today we will continue our study of the conditions faced by asylum seekers. I confirm that all witnesses have conducted the required technical tests in preparation for the meeting. For our first panel, I would like to welcome our witnesses. Today, in our first panel, we are joined by France Andre, spokesperson and coordinator for Comité d'Action des Personnes Sans Statut. And we are also joined by the Refugee Center, being represented by Abdullah Daoud, the executive director, and Pierre-Luc Bouchard, refugee lawyer and the head of legal department. Our third witness for today is Eva Gazal Redudru, vice president UNIPUR Integration Conseil au Canada. On behalf of all the members, I would like to welcome you all. You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and then we will go to our round of questioning. We will start with Mr. Andre. You can please begin. You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Good afternoon. Bonjour à toutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a privilege to have this opportunity to talk about the crisis situation experienced by migrants in general when they come to Canada. As an example, I'll talk about the Haitian migrant situation, but know that there are similarities experienced by other migrants from various origins. We must specify that right now, the vast majority of migrants who arrive at the border through Roxham Road are from Haiti, as was the case.
Madam Chair, I don't know if this is happening with anyone else's translations, but both English and French is happening at the same time.
We will get the checks done. Thank you.
If I may, Madam Chair, I think that the button in the interpretation booth has been improper. I think it's better now.
Mr. Andre, can you sentences so that we can see if it is working well?
Yes, good afternoon. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to talk about the crisis situation experienced by migrants in general.
Ms. Kwan?
But I'm getting some noise in my microphone. I'm getting a feedback.
Have you turned the French on the interpretation?
No, I have not.
Yeah, if you can do that. On the interpretation, please turn it to French.
Interpretation to French. Okay.
Now say a few sentences.
It's a privilege to have this opportunity to talk about the crisis situation experienced by migrants when they come to Canada. I will use the Haitian situation as an example.
Okay. Please go ahead, start.
So I will start?
Yeah, please start.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a privilege to be able to have this opportunity to talk about the crisis situation experienced by migrants when they come to Canada. I will use the Haitian migrant situation as an example, but know that there are similarities with other groups of migrants from other areas. We must specify that most migrants who come to the border through Roxham Road come from Haiti, as was the case back in 2017. Their arrival through Roxham Road is described as being irregular. But not only is it irregular, it's also very dramatic, because the Haitian migrants who have had to cross through many countries, going through forests and zones where they're targeted by bandits and sometimes attacked by wild animals. In the case of migrant women, some of them have been sexually assaulted along the way. You'll understand that such a migratory journey leaves trauma and consequences. The migrants go through the United States before arriving in Canada, but often decide to come here because of the poor treatment and the racism. We'll remember the the shocking images that circulated last year where you saw American border guards on horseback chasing migrants towards a river using a lasso as if they were hunting up slaves. Aside from these images, there's also the other facts that are shocking. The United States deported 28,000 Haitians without giving them an opportunity to have their claim heard. In such a context, Haitian migrants, like migrants from other countries, prefer to make their request for asylum in Canada. However, the Safe Third Party Agreement, according to this agreement, they have to make their claim in the United States. That explains why the migrants come to Canada irregularly. There is some inconsistency with the way files are processed here as a result of lack of resources. The other challenges concern shelter. In some cases, there's quarantine, which further delays the submission of documents. In other cases, migrants who were sheltered in Quebec are given a short notice that they have to find housing using their own means. If not, they will be bused to Ontario from Quebec, where they're then put in an Ontario detention center. I've heard testimony that several had not understood that they were being taken to another province. As for the brown paper document, which enables them to get a work permit, this requires preliminary documents that need to be filled out and sent electronically for review. However, not having the technical capacities or the ability to write in one of the official languages, some migrants send their documents late, which leads to really lengthy wait times before they're able to get a work permit. They have no other choice than to continue receiving last-minute assistance, which is inadequate and doesn't allow them to meet their basic needs, putting them in a precarious financial situation. Some choose to work under the table, and they're at the mercy of placement agencies that don't respect work standards or employers that expose them to abusive work conditions. A major concern is finding an immigration lawyer, either through legal aid or even in the private sector. At the same time, the government website is sometimes difficult to use. I have a lot more to say, but 5 minutes is not enough time to talk to you about the distress felt by many claimants who decide to come to Canada in the hope that they will be able to work and integrate into a society that is welcoming, safe, and where there is rule of law. Over the past few months, Haiti has been in the news because of the unstable situation and the humanitarian crisis, which has deteriorated in my country of origin. What's not explained in the media is the linkage between the Canada's foreign policy in Haiti and the fleeing of Haitian migrants to Canada. Canada must have a foreign policy that does not exacerbate the conflicts that exist abroad. Canada must welcome these migrants in a dignified and respectful manner. Once again, thank you for allowing me to speak on this issue.
Thank you. We will now proceed to Mr. Daoud, representing the Refugee Center. Mr. Daoud, you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. You can please go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be joined by Pierre-Luc Bouchard as well. Honorable Chair, Vice Chairs, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to submit a brief and appear on behalf of the Refugee Center here today. I'm joined by the head of our legal clinic, Maître Pierre-Luc Bouchard, to bring forth an issue that we believe needs to be addressed urgently by this committee and policymakers at large regarding the asylum-seeking process in Canada. Typically, as soon as an individual makes an asylum claim in Canada, whether it be an inland claim, a border claim, or irregular crossing, they are instantly given the Refugee Protection Claimant document, also famously known as the brown paper. As soon as they are granted this document, they're given 45 days to submit their paperwork and initialize their claim. The brown paper affords them certain rights within this country, including the interim federal health plan and the right to apply for a work permit and asylum in Canada. This committee is already aware that it can take up to 2 years to get a hearing with the IRB, also known as the Immigration Refugee Board. The brown paper is also the only form of Canadian photo identification given to the claimant, which is vital for their ability to reside in Canada while they wait for their hearing. In early January 2022, Maître Pierre-Luc Bouchard and I started encountering 2 additional documents, depending on the point of entry for the refugee claimant, in temporary lieu of the brown paper, titled the Acknowledgement of Claim and the Entry for Further Examination. Both these documents serve as a bureaucratic tool to delay the granting of the refugee claimant of the brown paper while stripping them of certain rights that the brown paper affords them. At first, it provided an appointment dated 3 to 6 weeks from the time of entry of the refugee claimant for them to acquire their brown paper and become eligible to apply for asylum in Canada. However, as time progressed, the appointment times for both these documents lengthened to 12 months to 24 months. Furthermore, these dates seem to be arbitrarily set. As one instance from our legal clinic saw an appointment given 16 months from the time of entry, and the appointment was on a Sunday where the RCC offices were closed. This practice is seemingly becoming a norm as well, as from our own internal statistics, till today, from September 1st, over 90% of the 312 asylum seekers we have worked with have received the acknowledgement of claim with a date in the future for a brown paper. With the existing delay in hearing times at the IRB, and now with the additional delays created by the CBSA and the RCC, we are witnessing an average time since entry that a refugee claimant spends waiting for their time to prove to gain safety in Canada go from 2 years to 4 years, most of which they do not have a Canadian photo ID nor the ability to work, as work permits are processed separately and take an extra 6 to 8 months to process, and this is only a recent policy that was passed. If this practice of additional bureaucratic hurdles continues, we'll witness devastatingly severe economic and social outcomes for the refugee claimant population. These delay tactics force refugee claimants to be dependent on social assistance without the ability to work and not only provide for themselves but for the Canadian economy as a whole. Furthermore, the Canadian photo ID that without a Canadian photo ID, they are forced into housing with little to no rights, as the only landlords willing to rent out to individuals without an official photo ID depend on cash-only payments in buildings with extremely poor conditions. Access to healthcare is also severely impacted, as the majority of clinics that accept the IFHB are not aware of this new document, the Acknowledgement of Claim, and turn away many of our clients. These unnecessary additional hurdles are forcing our clients into a cycle of systemic poverty. Despite common beliefs, Canada does have the means and the capability to provide for our future citizens with a better and more stable start for life in our country. The commendable Canadian response to previous world crises exemplifies how our nation could provide for vulnerable individuals, as we have witnessed government documentation being provided for vulnerable individuals and processed swiftly and hastily when it came to the Syrian, Afghan, and Ukrainian crisis more recently. Furthermore, the brown papers were being issued with fewer staff and fewer resources before COVID-19 and prior to our borders reopening. And now we're experiencing a similar or lesser amount of claims with more funding and more staff, making the reasoning for such forms puzzling at best. Pierre? Okay, just to be
Ouais. Est-ce que je vais peser? OK, non, c'est bon. Alors, pour continuer que ce que mon collègue...
To add to what my colleague has said, based on our findings and the outcomes we're witnessing, we strongly recommend to the committee a list of policy suggestions as outlined in our brief. Here are the two we believe are of the utmost importance and urgency. First, standardize the issuance of the brown paper or an open work permit on the time of arrival of the refugee claimant, or at least issue a temporary federal photo ID for refugee claimants that also allows them to apply for an open work permit online, because the other route is very lengthy. In addition, we have a second recommendation that we feel is very important and urgent. That is to extend the extension of the brown paper validity
We'll now proceed to Madame Rudura. So you will have 5 minutes. You can please begin.
Okay. Chers membres du comité parlementaire, chers invités, bonjour.
Good afternoon. My name is Eva Gazelle-Radudura, and I'm Vice President of UNIQUE, which is a nonprofit organization, which means United for Conscious Integration in Canada. UNIQUE's goal is to promote socio-professional integration that's harmonious for the Burundian diaspora and enable them to contribute to the development of their new country, Canada. As part of this invitation to testify, we asked a lot of questions of people who had crossed through Roxham, and we collected information. And in addition to this information, we regularly hear from members of the community and who we help to settle. And we've discussed the matter individually with more than a dozen people that have gone through, crossed over at Roxham Road with a guarantee that their anonymity will be maintained. All of the testimony obtained from people who have crossed at Roxham talked about the fact that they were greeted very warmly in a humane way by the border officers in general. The people who expressed that they benefited from good instructions as to the administrative formalities and help in navigating the support services. One woman who went through this when she was pregnant said that she was greeted in French. She felt reassured, not only because of the language, but by the human warmth of the Canadian officers. After helping with the administrative procedures, the officers showed her where she could buy food and guided her to a station where she could take the bus to go to the Montreal YMCA. Her file was transferred to Ottawa, where she is now living with her husband and two sons. This woman is the wife of the current president of Unique, Corneille Baruta, who joined her a few years later. Today, both work at the RCMP. During our conversations, everyone seemed to be positive about their experience. We also got the testimony of a young man who arrived a few months ago through Roxham and who didn't know anyone in Canada. He told us that all he knew about this country was that he could have a life that was worth living. He managed to find housing, and he's impatiently waiting for a work permit so that he can begin working as quickly as possible. This desire to work is something that we often see in the Burundian population living in Canada. This community is made up of people who benefited initially from status of being a protected refugee, and now today they're permanent residents. In the Burundian community of Canada, we find public servants who are working both federally and provincially, healthcare workers that save lives and contribute to ensure the viability of the Canadian systems from one ocean to the next. There are successful entrepreneurs who create jobs, participate in the strengthening of the Canadian economy, experienced engineers. Another characteristic of our Burundian community is its good contribution to the Canadian Francophonie. Between 2016 and 2020, 5.5% of the Francophone immigration in Canada outside Quebec came from Burundi. Between 2006 and 2016, Burundi was ranked second in terms of Francophone settlement in Ontario. Finally, asylum claimants are also potential residents and Canadian and citizens of tomorrow's Canada. By giving these asylum seekers a new life, Canada, in exchange, receives so much from them: their knowledge, their skill, their desire to work, and in some cases, their youth. You will find in the appendix an article written by Mr. Kone Nibaruta, the president of our organization, who celebrates Canada. His article is entitled Acknowledgement of a gratitude of a Canadian citizenship. That Mr. Nibaruta's story, who is now a proud and committed Canadian citizen, resembles that of many others we've heard from in our community. This story was made possible because of his entry through Roxham Road and continues with the acknowledgement of proud and engaged citizen.
Thank you. We will now proceed to our round of questioning. We will begin with Ms. Rempel Gardner. Ms. Rempel Gardner, you will have 6 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please begin.
Thank you, Chair. My question is, I'll start with Mr. Andre. Mr. Andre, has the United States, I believe this month, they've extended temporary protected status for Haitian nationals, is that correct, that are making asylum claims?
Oui, c'est exact depuis maintenant quelques.
Yes, that's been the case for a few weeks now. However, there's a lot of uncertainty. Still, we saw that there's a lot of anxiety with respect to this process.
I'm going to just try and elicit yes or no answers to a certain extent because I want to get through a line of questioning in a short period of time. So the temporary protection status has been afforded to Haitian nationals. Do you think that this suggests that the American legislative framework for being able to evaluate ongoings or emergent issues in a country allows for flexibility in extending additional protection to asylum claimants?
No.
No.
Okay. You said that in your testimony that Haitian nationals prefer to file their claims in Canada as opposed to the U.S. With the United States having designated temporary protection status to Haitian nationals, is there another reason for preference in claiming asylum in Canada?
Parce que dans beaucoup
In many cases, there are a lot of Haitians who are deported. This is done in an arbitrary fashion, and which motivates people to come here in Canada to apply.
And I thank you for your brevity. Do you have evidence of the arbitrary nature that you just referred to?
certaines
Certainly. People I've contacted were detained and deported. There are also people who have come here and who found themselves sent back to the United States and were deported also.
Did they not have pending refugee claims, or had they not gone through any process whatsoever?
Are you talking about here in Canada?
Yes, primarily.
non,
No. In most cases, there is a hearing that's set up, and the people, with what's happened recently, where 28 people were deported, there's this fear of being detained and deported.
The difference between a perception of fear and perhaps a ruling that was established through a hearing process.
et je
I think that a lot of people leave their country, and they wouldn't do this if were it not for the conflicts. The United States is a safe country, but there is a selection of people. Some people are given more priority over others. I have observed this a lot and even Canada, a lot of people seem to be deported.
Recommendation then, perhaps to decrease the pull factor and preference to one country over another, a recommendation could be that the government seek to strengthen review processes to ensure that there isn't discrimination against persons from any country when making asylum claims, so that we aren't subject to arbitrary or subjective measurements of discrimination. Would you agree?
je serais d'accord.
I would agree that we have to reassess the Safe Third Country Agreement, and I also think we need to review what happens here at the border with
Time I have remaining, I think I just want to clarify, because I think I've heard contradictory testimony. You just recently said that you believe that the United States is a safe country, but said that the Safe Third Country Agreement shouldn't apply.
Non pas.
How do you reconcile that? Perhaps it's translation.
Aucun moment,
No, I never said that the United States is a safe country. Contrary to that, it is not a safe country. That's why the people come here. So I didn't want to suggest that they were a safe country. I think that there is discrimination elsewhere.
Thank you. Do you believe that in order to quantify discrimination, because I believe that's, frankly, I've been on this committee for over 7 years here and there, Do you think that we need to have better ways of quantifying discrimination so that it's not a subjective argument that's made based on whoever might be in office or not in office in either in Canada or the U.S.?
I think that right now the problem is that people are poorly prepared, and sometimes files haven't been put together well, and some people are being refused and deported. So discrimination is not something that Canada supports. However, inaudible for the interpreter. However, we have to ensure that there are no abuses. Some, in my opinion.
Time is up, Ms. Rempel Garner. We will now proceed to Ms. Kaya Baga. Ms. Kaya Baga, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'aimerais tout.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking our witnesses for coming here today and partaking in this very important discussion. Mr. André, we agree that discrimination is something that's difficult to quantify. It's something you have to experience before you can really understand it. So I'd like to begin by thanking Ms. Redudura for her testimony. She talked about the Burundian community. I'm part of this community. And I'd like to mention that you mentioned that Burundians contribute a lot to Canada. Why do you think that people from the Burundian community or other individuals that go through Roxham choose to go through this route? Do you think that the danger that they're facing pushes them to go through Roxham, and that they're taking a lot of risk to come here in Canada? And this road, do Burundians find that the U.S. is a safe country for them? Why don't they stay there? Thank you for your question, Ms. Kaya Baga. According to our discussions with people in our community, what I understood is that people that go through Roxham are afraid that they won't be accepted. They don't have any direct family necessarily. And also, they want to find themselves in a place where people know who they are. They're francophone. Hearing French really reassured me. So finding myself in a country where people could see me, could understand me, was important. Everybody has their own story. Some people have been pursuing this dream to be in a place where they can have peace. There's fear that in the United States that they don't think that they'll be welcomed the same way. And so, in your opinion, do you think that Burundians want to come to Canada because of the language? But do you also think that shutting down this road would be a valid solution, or do you think that you would make another type of recommendation to the government? I think that people leave not because they're fleeing from something. So shutting down Roxham, people will find another way to get through because they're fleeing from something. It would be just too oversimplified. Based on the testimony I've received, why people use this route, it struck me. Everybody was grateful. Everybody really valued the Canadian openness. The people I talked to had no bad experiences with the Canadian officials. What I could suggest is to perhaps strengthen our ability or capacity there, because people are going to go through there one way or the other. I don't know if that's the answer but that's based on what I've been hearing. And so people are going to use this road if they're fleeing from something. So it's best that we have measures in place that give security to people who are fleeing bad situations. They're doing so because of the risks that they experience. That's my opinion. What I've seen is that the journeys that people take because of their the reasons they flee, I think that there are people who, we see these situations throughout the world. We see people in the Mediterranean Sea. Mr. André, you talked about the Haitian community that tends to use this road. Earlier, we talked about the United States and what we could do to facilitate the lives of for these people. What comment would you add to that? What can we here in Canada do to ensure that these people are safe? I think that the border, well, I haven't heard any heard about bad experiences at the border either. As soon as they cross the border, as my colleague suggested, they should be given the brown paper and including access to social assistance and a work permit so that they'll be able to contribute and become taxpayers so they can be full citizens as quickly as possible. Give them the opportunity. As soon as they set foot here, we have a shortage of labor here. Instead of waiting and looking at what's happening on WhatsApp, let's the fact that people are waiting more than 8 months, I think we need to deal with that.
We will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Desaep. You will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for this very important study that was started at the initiative of the Bloc, because we're really looking at the humanitarian situation at Roxham Road, and this will be included in the report. Mr. André, I have an important question for you. We heard about criminal smugglers who work in the United States in order to get money from migrants. Have you heard about these stories, and could you elaborate on that? Yes, indeed. I had the opportunity of going to Florida with the program Enquête, and we did talk to some of these groups that were taking advantage of these migrants. But before they get to the United States, I can tell you there's lots of other people who have got lots of money of these people. Sometimes we're talking about over $8,000 from these people. Sometimes it adds up to $35,000. So these people are prepared to give all they have. And you feel that. So, yes, there are people who take advantage of their vulnerability, but they're prepared to do anything to get here. And if it's not these people that are taking advantage of them, there'll be other people who might even ask for even more money. We have to treat people with dignity and respect here, and I think we can show that our country has much bigger when you talk about welcoming people with dignity. You also talked about in your opening statement the fact that we should suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement. Can Canada do this unilaterally without asking permission from anyone else? So we could take people in right across the Canadian border, and rather than having them go through the forest or regular roads. Could you talk further on the suspension of the agreement? Yes. Thank you for your question. I don't know if the United States uses this safe third country agreement to send people here rather than processing them there, but I think because it's easier to show that they have a very hostile attitude. There are some people who have spent months and months waiting for their brown paper. They've decided to travel through the forest just last week. Inaudible for the interpreter. So these are all things that we need to take into consideration, and Canada has to show that we are not like this. We have to open up a regular passing.
Je continue avec vous.
I continue with you because it's so interesting. You know, have you read some of the articles in La Presse this weekend concerning community organizations who couldn't provide essential services to migrants who come from all over the world and who are asking for help? Especially in Montreal, community organizations cannot satisfy the demand. Isn't that the result of the fact that all immigrants are coming from the same place or entering from the same road, and community organizations are overwhelmed by the demands and they can't help all? Is that a possibility? Yes, it is. We're not talking only about these organizations. What about the welcoming center at the border? Even IRCC services are about to break down. If we had 36 hours in a day, it wouldn't even be enough to welcome all these people and to give them the necessary information, the right information. Right now, it's so dysfunctional. It's not everyone who receives the same information, and when I meet them, I have to explain to them what all the required documents, how to fill in the forms. So that's a lot of pressure on these community organizations. People even are coming to get some food every day. I don't have much time left. I would like now to go to Mr. Bouchard and your recommendations. Do you have this lifting of the safe country, the third safe country? As Mr. André said, people are afraid of American authorities. Even this morning, a young of LGBT from Sierra Leone who probably went up to Ecuador and then up to Canada. When he was in the States, he was detained for months. And finally, a Florida community organizations, Bellbound LGBT or something like that, who provided a caution of $5,000 so he could be freed. Then he had a tracer on his leg, and eventually he ended up at Wrexham Road, and he started the process of asylum seeker. We have many of these examples, many families who have to go through that. So you support the fact that we should suspend the third country agreement. For analysts, he said yes.
And you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. I'd like to just ask the representatives from the Refugee Center to put on the record their recommendations for the committee, after which I would have one very specific question for them.
La dernière recommandation.
The last recommendation we had, and we couldn't go through it, it was the one to extend the validity of the documents for asylum seekers. Now it's 2 years, and we propose 4 years. Here, witnesses are trying to convince you that there's a lot of bureaucracy for these people who have a hard time with computers and stuff. So the last recommendation was to extend the validity period of asylum seeker documents, from 2 years to 4 years.
Ask all the witnesses this one very specific question. Given the situation that we know and the dangers to which asylum seekers are in, should the Canadian government, in the very minimum, suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement? If I could get a full round of responses from everyone on a clear answer and maybe just a short bit on why that should be done. I will start with Mr. Duat.
Yes, they should suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement. That basically, we're forcing asylum seekers to go into terrain that's very dangerous. We've already established that these are legitimate claims, that what they're going through is very unfortunate. And in order to regulate the matter and in order to ensure that the government can service them correctly and that community organizations can serve them correctly, we need to suspend it.
Do you have anything to add, Mr. Bouchard, to that answer?
No, I think it's.
Okay,
I think
thank
you summarized it well.
Then I will move on to. Then I'll move on to Ms. Rodedura.
Selon ce que, encore une fois,
According to what our community tells us, what we suggest is to make sure that we welcome with dignity people who are crossing and at those points. And I don't think that this agreement has something to do with what people will have to endure. The only thing Canada can control is how they will help people control their life and contribute to society. Because for the rest, I think people go through a lot of hard situations, even before going through that road, coming to Roxham Road.
Would not have to go through irregular entries. In fact, they could go through the official ports of entry without any fear. Because right now, because of the Safe Third Country Agreement, they're not allowed to do that. And when they do, they'll be rejected automatically. So which is why I asked the question if the government should suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement. I'm going to turn to Mr. Andre, actually, on the screen there on the same question.
Alors oui, donc je le
Yes. I repeat, I think that the Safe Third Country Agreement must be revoked. I think people would have less fear, and it would be a way of welcoming them that is much better. If you go through a route which says if you continue, we will arrest you, is stress. It's a form of aggression, and people have gone through many countries in difficult situations. So I strongly suggest that the agreement be revoked.
Of course, uses the term they're modernizing, quote unquote, the Safe Third Country Agreement. And they won't actually really tell us what that means and what their plans are in their negotiations with the United States. But what we've seen, of course, is that the government, in a hidden kind of way, expanded the use of the Safe Third Country Agreement. In the Omnibus Budget Bill, Bill C-97, a 379-page document, the government snuck in there the Safe Third Country Agreement application to the Five Eyes countries, which automatically turns people away if they try to seek asylum here in Canada. Do you think that's right? Mr. To the Refugee Center, I don't know who wanted to respond to that.
Not going along with what we previously said, that's not right. Given what they're going through, and given the legitimacy of these claims and what these individuals are going through, we should not be rejecting them because we've already established that the alternative is not good and they'll be facing danger otherwise.
Mr. Andres, for the same question.
Oui, alors merci pour la question. Je crois effectivement.
Thank you for the question. I think that, so we're talking about the Five Eyes countries, so 5 countries now. So it shows that we're more and more closed to immigration. And instead of canceling this agreement with the United States, we're adding restriction elsewhere in the world for people who would like to come here and share our values. I think that the Canadian government is not clearly revealing that it has this intention.
brown paper and the delay, the government added this entry for further examination document. Is that new?
Yeah, we've started seeing it since January 2022. They've always had the right to do it, but we've only seen it being established since January 2022.
And as a result of that, how much time has been added to the processing period?
An additional 12 to 24 months, depending on the CBSA officer or RSC agent that wants to issue the document.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up. We will now proceed to our second round. Mr. Redekop, you will have 2 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to give my time to Mr. Bernal-Duceppe.
I appreciate it. I thank my conservative friends who are giving me a bit of time. Quickly, just one small question, Madame Rodudura. I understand that you were invited by one party in particular, and that's all right, and I very much appreciated your testimony. But if we gave immigrants the possibility to arrive at different regular entry points and to have access more quickly to community resources, would you say yes to that? I would say yes to everything that gives people in need and immigrants the possibility of finding a safe place and services that they need. Mr. André, did you feel in the past months where there were more migrants that the services to immigrants in Montreal are less and less good because of the fact that there are more and more people arriving and they're concentrated in one place? Yes. Where I am now is an office that serves refugees, and we see more and more of them arriving. And don't forget that it's cold quickly here. People don't have coats, boots, food. I'm not here to brag, but I have to pay money myself for a family to be able to buy milk. They were in my office to say that they needed milk and they couldn't afford to buy it because they had been waiting for the brown paper for months and for the work permit. So logically, if we suspend the safe third country agreement, people would arrive at different entry points and logically they would access more services. Yes, because they would end up in other provinces instead of being concentrated mostly in Quebec, where they were during an election period where they were seen as carrying COVID. I am 100% with you, Mr. André.
Round of questioning, you can please begin.
My question will go to Mr. Andre as well. Mr. Andre, you mentioned that people prefer to come to Canada over US, but that is the fact. Anywhere from around the world, people want to live in Canada, and I'm one of those examples as well. But that should not be the only reason for us to have the asylum seekers. Because my worry is this: if we cancel the safe third country agreement, we have seen 2.5 million individuals that have crossed the border on the Mexico-US border. And if we do not have this in place, we will have a difficult time. What would you say about that? People can freely move into Canada.
Monsieur Dhaliwal, tout comme vous, je suis un immigrant.
Just as you, Mr. Dhaliwal, I am an immigrant, and as you, my parents fled. They fled Haiti under the Duvalier regime. So if Canada cannot afford to receive people with dignity when they do have reasons to leave their country, one must not forget that Canada is linked to certain countries' policies, and so sometimes policies have a role in the fact that people need to flee their country. So why can we not support them?
To the other nations, in absolute numbers, we accepted more refugees than any other country, and in fact, Canada is very, very generous when it comes to doing that. And you also mentioned that U.S. is not a safe country to live. In fact, my brother, who's a Canadian citizen, he's working for a Canadian company. I mean, I haven't heard. That U.S. is not a safe place compared to Canada. And would you comment on that?
Bien, écoutez, j'ai de la famille qui vit.
Listen, I do have family living in the States. I have nephews who are studying at university, and they are privileged. But the people who are arriving via Roxham Road do not have this kind of training, and they risk being modern slaves.
Dhaliwal, we will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Desapp. Mr. Brunel Desapp, you will have 90 seconds for your round of questioning. You can please begin.
Écoutez, je vais donner la...
I will let Mr. André continue. I'm giving you free time to say what you wish to say. I want to thank Canada for welcoming my parents, and I understand the problems that people live. When I see in my office a woman who was raped by 15 people and who saw her husband kill himself, and she comes back here pregnant, alone, I think that we have an obligation to demonstrate that we are a society which has values. I suggest a work permit as quickly as possible and automatically with a social insurance number so that people can start working. And I suggest finding a way to bring them to regions, maybe incentives, so that people do not stay in one place only where there is not enough housing, etc. So I agree with our policies, but I think that there are changes to be made, and thank you to the lawyers for their work. I know that a new system was imposed, and it's virtual, and it's difficult, and the system doesn't always work. So there's a lot of work to do in order to find a way for people to be reassured that they will be heard here and that they will be able to participate.
30 seconds, you can please begin.
On the question around the brown paper that's so vital, would you recommend that the government should issue that to the asylum seekers on arrival? Mr. Duda?
Yes, they should, as they have before.
Mr. Andre, what do you think about that?
Oui, certainement, je crois que c'était...
Yes, of course, this is essential.
Canada used to actually have an exemption for the Safe Third Country Agreement, a second one, which would exempt individuals who are faced with a return back to their country of origin when it's not safe to do so. There was a moratorium for that to be in place. The Harper government in 2009 took that away. Should Canada be reinstating that in the face of the fact that they're not going to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement, at least for those who are faced with gender-based violence, for example, or those who are faced with gang violence, to all the witnesses?
Yes, I think it's pretty clear.
Mr. Andre?
Oui, c'est certain.
Yes, of course. Et Madame Roudoudura?
Thank you. On the question around the United States, right now, given a change in administration, some people will say, oh, but the U.S. is a safe country for these asylum seekers. Is it, Mr. Andre?
Non, ce n'est pas un pays sûr.
No, it is not a safe country. I see that every day. Just as in Canada, people will disappear and be abused. I think that we have to do away with this safe country, safe third country.
Thank all the witnesses for appearing before the committee. Thank you for your time and important testimony. And some of you are coming for the second time. Last time we were not able to accommodate you because of the vote. So I really want to thank you for taking out the time once again and appearing before the committee. So with that, this panel comes to an end, and we will suspend the meeting for a few minutes so that sound checks can be done for the second panel. So the meeting is suspended. Thank you. On behalf of all the members of this committee, I would like to welcome our witnesses for this panel. Today, in this panel, we are joined by Ms. Maureen Silkoff, lawyer and the past president for Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers. We are also joined by Ms. Perla Abu-Jaid, lawyer, and Mr. Vincent Desbiens, lawyer from Quebec Immigration Lawyers Association. Our third witness for today is Stéphane Reichold, Director General, Table des Concentrats des Organismes ou Services des Personnes Réfugiées et Immigrants. You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. We will begin with Ms. Silkoff. Ms. Silkoff, you can please begin. You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you for the invitation to appear. The Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers is a national organization engaged in advocacy, litigation, and education regarding the rights of refugees and migrants. As Minister Fraser noted last week, no one chooses to be a refugee, and people who cross into Canada between ports of entry are desperate to find safety. One crossing haunts me. A woman traumatized by gender-based violence in her home country, barred from seeking refugee protection in the U.S., and desperate not to be deported to further harm, crossed into Canada with her 2 minor children by hanging onto the back of a freight train. She was later accepted as a refugee. When this committee looked at the agreement back in 2002, it anticipated that if irregular entry becomes an issue and if the numbers do not decrease, the agreement should be suspended or ended. I'll explain why it's time to revisit the STCA based on 5 lessons learned, and then I'll offer a recommendation. Lesson 1. The mode of entry to Canada says nothing about the merits of a refugee claim. Acceptance rates are very similar, regardless of how you arrive. The acceptance rates for cases decided on their merits, generally for refugees, is 66%, and the acceptance rate for irregular crossers is 61%. Lesson 2. The STCA is the cause of Roxham Road, and ending the agreement or creating more exceptions to it will disperse people from coast to coast and eliminate the funnel to Quebec. Cities and provinces throughout Canada can then provide settlement services. Lesson number 3. The number of border entries may not increase, as people may simply be rerouted. In fact, Althea Raj recently reported about a senior IRCC official noting that an end to the STCA means that the situation, quote, might not change that much, because what would happen is you wouldn't have a Roxham Road. Then people would cross at the ports of entry, and they might therefore go to different ports of entry, end quote. The federal court thought the same thing. In its 2020 decision, it indicated that there was actually no evidence that numbers would increase if the STCA ended, and further, that the departments have always managed ebbs and flows. And recall, of course, that our geographic location means that Canada will always only welcome a very small drop in the global bucket of refugees. Lesson 4. There's talk about modernization, but expansion will drive more people to enter irregularly, undetected, and without any kind of screening. And of course, it will put more lives at risk. Lesson 5. People who enter through Roxham Road contribute to Canada in meaningful ways. This includes a significant number of guardian angels, those who risked their lives during the height of the pandemic, working in long-term care homes and elsewhere. So the conclusion that we can draw is that the deleterious effects of the STCA at this point clearly outweigh its benefits. One option, of course, is to end or suspend the STCA, but there's an alternative. Article 6 of the STCA allows Canada to exempt classes of people or individuals on public policy grounds. It states the following: either party may, at its own discretion, examine any refugee claim made to that party where it determines that it is in the public interest to do so. This provides the much-needed flexibility to address current issues. Canada now uses only one public policy exemption. That's for individuals facing the death penalty. There used to be a second one, as mentioned earlier, for people who are on Canada's list of countries to which we don't deport, and that was ended in 2009. So options at this point could include expanding exemptions and allowing for gender-based claims, which, despite the repeal of the matter of AB, remain highly subject to highly problematic restrictions. In fact, the UNHCR had recommended using public policy exemptions when it commented on Canada's draft regulations back in 2002, and this included for gender-based claims. As well, exemptions could be created for vulnerable people who are turned around at the border and put into U.S. jails. Of course, the images of kids in cages offer a horrific window into the system that jails vulnerable people when they're simply seeking safety. Public policy exemptions have been a mainstay of our immigration system, and it makes sense to put them to use at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now proceed to Ms. Abu Joad or Mr. Despens, whoever will take the lead. You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. You can please begin.
Bonjour à tous et merci de l'invitation.
Thank you for the invitation. The Quebec Immigration Lawyers Association was established more than 30 years ago and represents more than 460 lawyers working in the field of immigration law and refugee protection. Our association maintains that the only solution to protect the health, security, and integrity of claimants is to abolish the STCA. In the absence of this agreement, there would be a better distribution of claimants' asylum seekers throughout Canada and would allow better access to social and legal services that are required without leading to an increase in the number of claims. Nonetheless, and because of this agreement, most claimant assignments come through Quebec and they make an application as soon as they arrive, which leads to considerable impacts or repercussions for these people who have already suffered too much. Asylum seekers who arrive in Quebec come to a system that's already overworked, and we have to bear in mind that these people who come to the border do so because they're hoping to be protected by Canada and their life is in danger. Some of them aren't able to find a lawyer, and they're not able to have their claim heard properly. Needless to say, when this happens, they're not able to have the security which they so much want to have. Needless to say, because of this incapacity to have justice for new comers, there is a lot of psychological and emotional distress, both in the short and long term. We, the lawyers on the front line, see this on a daily basis. Not only are asylum seekers finding it difficult to find a lawyer, but they're also getting, they're having problems getting help from organizations that help them with housing, etc. Some say that the arrival of asylum seekers in Quebec needs to be dealt with otherwise. The reality is that, first of all, their mobility is restricted because they have to wait to get their work papers through the mail system in order to earn a living. Once the asylum seekers do manage to find a lawyer, find a housing, and register their children at schools, it becomes very difficult to move around. Needless to say, we need to have a better work permit system. Some of these new migrants cannot be dealt with in a humane, serene fashion as they deserve to be by our border people. Because of the high volume of claims, the border personnel don't have the time they need to really ensure that these asylum seekers understand that the information is getting across to the asylum seeker, which creates a lot of anxiety. Their psychological and emotional integrity suffers greatly, particularly in a system where the claim system is becoming more and more complex. In some cases, families are separated and the members find it very difficult to information about their relatives. For example, if one of their family members is detained or hospitalized, that creates a lot of stress and panic for each member of the family who doesn't know what's happening with everybody else. The people arrive upset in our offices and they feel very unstable. The lawyer has to step in for the government to inform them about how their claim process is going to be processed. To conclude, some measures need to be put in place in order to more equitably distribute asylum seekers throughout Canada. Several people have been transferred from Quebec to Ontario, but unfortunately, many people don't understand what's happening, and they don't even want to change provinces. It wasn't really their wish to go to Ontario and to have to go through another migratory journey when they've already suffered just to get to Canada. So once people have been released from detention, they have to get back to Quebec by themselves. We can't imagine the situation where families have so much anguish because of such a separation. We respectfully submit that these attempts to rectify the situation are only being exacerbated. By closing Roxham, it would be even more devastating than the status quo. And if we keep the agreement, many migrants who have had their life put in danger when they try to cross the borders in the middle of winter are facing this reality. Shutting down Roxham would not prevent asylum seekers from coming to Canada. So we need to ensure that the security, integrity, and health of people who are in jeopardy are protected in the long term. Those who deserve our protection need to get it. Thank you very much.
Richold, Mr. Richold, you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. You can please begin.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Oh, there's some feedback in my ears. I'm the director of the Table de concertation des organismes au service des personnes réfugiées et immigrants. We represent 60 organizations that help welcome newcomers to Canada, particularly those that have no status. I'm going to be focusing on the social and health measures because the other aspects have been covered by all the lawyers who are now sitting around the table. So I'd like to focus on the organizations that are dealing with this humanitarian problem in Quebec. I think everyone is aware of this, but we have to take steps. As you know, for decades now in Quebec, the asylum seekers come to Quebec. We take care of them with housing. We get social services involved in Quebec and an organization called TRIDA, which provides them with temporary housing for 4 to 6 weeks until they're able to get their first welfare check. And after, we ask them to leave the temporary shelter and leave them to their own devices. It's worked quite well in past years, but with the new system, the system is no longer working well, and Quebec told the federal government that there's a cap on its ability to welcome everyone in, and the federal government is now responsible for looking after these new migrants in hotels in Montreal. It's temporary, but they don't have social services. And so medical care and all that goes along with it. So that creates a lot of pressure on community organizations that try to help them, such as my colleague France André described. They're not funded to provide such services. These are charitable organizations that are self-funding and they can only provide limited services in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada. This is Quebec. They need to be able to provide essential services. And we feel that since January, there have been about 47,000 claimants in Quebec, and nobody makes any distinguishes between the type of services that are provided to these people if they come in through regular or irregular channels. And the settlement organizations no longer have the capacity. They're overworked, and as was mentioned earlier, they're more and more now. The situation is becoming urgent. So everything is falling onto the shoulders of these community organizations. So women's shelters, centers for homeless people, everybody's trying to step in and help these people survive. And we're very concerned. We're really at a tipping point in Montreal with the volumes that we're seeing. And it's not like it is at the Mexican border or in Europe, but still, it's serious. And what we're proposing and what we're asking the federal government to do is to set up, maybe through the Red Cross or some other outfit, provide shelter to these vulnerable families, because it's almost impossible to find housing for these people, and a lot of people are in homeless shelters, and they don't have documents. So we have to resolve that problem. So the recommendation to you is that the federal government, because the situation in Quebec, it's like a divorced couple. They can't agree as to how to look after the children. And everybody is blaming each other for the situation. Meanwhile, the children are left to their own devices. And that's the case of asylum seekers right now. So the federal and the provincial government have to come to an agreement.
And you can talk further when we go into round of questioning. So with that, we will begin our first round of questioning with Mr. Reddycorp. Mr. Reddycorp, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for appearing today. Your testimony is helpful. Ms. Silkoff, I wanted to ask you, we've heard different testimony about if we were to scrap the Safe Third Country Agreement, that there would likely be an increase in migrants coming to Canada. You had talked in your number 3 point, I think it was, about that number may not increase, and then you quoted, I think, a reporter who wrote a story. Do you have actual evidence beyond that to suggest why that would be true?
Okay, I think it's actually, it's interesting because, there's concern, right, about the increase in numbers. But I think we have to separate what we know from what we're just fearing. And what we know is that there's been no evidence to show that there will in fact be an increase. There was evidence provided through CBSA to the federal court in the Safe Third Country Agreement challenge, but there was no evidence. The court found that there was actually no evidence that there would be an increase, that there had not been statistics provided about that. And I know that case is on appeal, but actually that point itself has not been appealed. And the
I have a very limited time, but we just heard in the previous panel that there are great numbers of Haitians coming into the United States. So you haven't given me any evidence to suggest that the number won't increase. With all of the Haitians, for example, coming to the United States, there's going to be an increase of migrants in the U.S., which to me, common sense would say that will put increased pressure, especially if we were to eliminate the agreement. Do you not agree with that?
Not necessarily, because if there are adequate programs in the United States that would give people protection, right? And we just talked about temporary protected status. So, I think we have to look at the situation, but we know that there's times when there are fewer people, there's times where there are more people, right? And we know that there's always going to be limitations because of our geographic location.
So another question, you mentioned that you said, I think, the negatives outweigh the benefits. I'm curious, from your perspective, what are the benefits of the Safe Third Country Agreement?
Well, I think, it was put in place because it was seen that the United States was a reliable partner for sharing responsibilities regarding refugees. That was, the objective and the raison d'être for the agreement itself. But we know now that the problems associated with it outweigh any benefits. And in fact, this committee itself in 2002 was concerned, and if there would be problems, it said, okay, it has to be revisited, and we might even suspend, right? We can suspend unilaterally, or perhaps it should end. So I think it was anticipated that there could be problems, and now we see how they've come to fruition really. We've seen them.
Mr. Debian, I'm just kind of curious to know approximately how many clients have you dealt with through Roxham Road?
I'm sorry, I'm going to take over the questions for the Acadie. So I've been practicing for 10 years, and we've been, I've dealt with, we deal with them every day.
Approximate, like, are we talking 10, 100, 1,000?
In hundreds, I would say.
Okay.
Like, I can't give a number in itself because we don't do a distinction between someone coming from Roxham Road or someone doing coming regularly.
Do the clients from Roxham Road typically stay in government-sponsored hotels?
Yes, but not all of them.
And typically, how long do they stay in the hotels?
I'm not positioned to be able to tell you that. I don't have the numbers.
Okay. What, in terms of timing, obviously we heard testimony that the wait times have been increasing. What are you seeing on the ground from a wait time, specifically on the IRB?
Are you talking about when they're transferred to the IRB or before that?
Yeah, I guess really there's two things. The time that it takes to get their so-called brown paper, and then the time that it takes for the IRB to process them.
So recently we've got approximately a year to get the brown paper, and then from that, when they are transferred to the IRB, we had a waiting time of 2 years approximately, and sometimes more. I think IRB will be able to answer the delays exactly. However, we've seen an acceleration in going in front and having their hearing.
So one of the things that we can do as a committee is we can make recommendations to the government. And one of the things that's coming to my mind as we go through this testimony is that we should be recommending that the government reduce the wait time in the IRB significantly. What do you think of that, and what do you think would be a reasonable time frame to shoot for a waiting time for the IRB?
The problem is not the waiting time. I think the problem is access to justice and access to a lawyer. So right now, the problematic on the field is actually claimants to have access to a lawyer to be able to be well represented and to be able to present their case in a proper way. So this is one of the problematics that we're seeing on the field.
So let's say that a claimant does have access to a lawyer. What's a reasonable time for the IRB? What would you suggest?
The fastest is the better. It depends on the clients if the file is ready, but right now it's not what we're seeing on the field. I cannot give a time frame because it really depends. If you're talking about giving the story, 45 days is, well, right now to be able to fill out the forms and give their stories, they have 45 days. However, we think it's a short period of time because before to be able to get the story from a client, create that le lien de confiance. So to be able to get.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up for Mr. Redekop. We will now proceed to Ms. Kayabaga. Ms. Kayabaga, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'aimerais encore.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would like to thank the witnesses once more. I have a question for Mr. Ragehold. According to you, could you tell us about the way that Quebec conforms to the STCA, and do you think that the bilateral negotiations between Canada and the United States, would the Quebec prefer a more strict control of borders, which would be to restrict the approach to the Roxham Road, or a more open way that would allow people to arrive at the regular point at Saint-Bernard-de-la-Colle? It's a question for Mr. Ragehold. It's Reichhold. Thank you for the correction. You can say Reichhold in French if you want. So, as far as I know, the current Quebec government has not taken a position on the Safe Third Country Agreement or on the way that we should look after the entry of asylum seekers at the border, because it's not something that's in Quebec's jurisdiction. Quebec has some things to do when people arrive, but like many colleagues around the table, we are all convinced that if the Safe Third Country Agreement was suspended, things would be done in a more controlled fashion, and people would be spread out in other parts of Canada, and there would be less pressure on Quebec for the services and for the legal side. So we are in favor, and I suppose that the Quebec government would also prefer for people to enter at all Canadian border entry points. And if Roxham Road was closed, would this prevent refugees to cross the border into Quebec? Absolutely not. And I don't know how you want to close this road. Let's say that you put a fence on a section of 1 kilometer around Roxham Road. Well, people go across the Mexican border, the Greek border. They just go around the fence and enter anyways, but in a more risky fashion. Question: what is the pressure that Quebec could see on refugees that would use these routes if we closed Roxham Road? I cannot visualize how you could close it with a fence, or how. I don't know. People will just go around the fence. It's normal. That's what everyone will do. So they will enter anyways, but there will no longer be any controls when they enter Canadian territory. I don't think anyone wants this. And what do you think of the fact that the number of asylum seekers would increase? So do you think we would see the same numbers as we see in the United States? If we closed Roxham Road, but we cannot close it, I think that the only solution would be to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement, and then we would not need Roxham Road anymore. If we closed Roxham Road, do you think it would be a way forward or a step backwards? It would cause indescribable chaos. People would try to find other pathways that are less safe than Roxham Road. So it's in no one's interest, neither in the interest of refugees or the Canadian society or provinces. It's not a good idea. And now I have a question for Ms. Silkoff.
The decision to cross over from who do not see the United States as a safe country. For example, Mr. Andre from earlier had mentioned the Haitian community, and we also heard from other people such as Burundians who land in the United States but still make it to Roxham Road. What do you think that is? Why are they not seeing the United States as a safe country for them to stay?
Okay, I think we have to look at very specific aspects of the U.S. asylum system to understand. Because when people say it's not safe, people don't have a clear conception. So what we do know is this. If someone has a gender-based claim, right, because they fear domestic violence, they fear sexual assault from strangers, or they've been subject to female genital mutilation, the law in the United States is so restrictive that the UNHCR has criticized how restrictive it is. And in terms of the Canadian law, it's much more narrow. So that's a specific example of a class or group of people who don't have a fair shot at getting protection in the United States. And that's why people would want to come to Canada to make a claim. So that's one specific example, right, to bring it to practical grounds, right? Another example is there's a one-year bar in the United States. So if you don't make your claim within that 1 year, you can't enter the asylum system, right? So that's another huge problem. And in fact, this is linked to gender-based claims because often women in that situation...
interrupting. Time is up for Ms. Kaya Baga.
Thank you.
We will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Desapp for 6 minutes. You can please begin. You will have 6 minutes. Mr. Brunel Desapp.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci à tous les témoins qui sont présents pour cette importante.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for this important study. I think it's quite clear, Mr. Reithold, we have to, it's one thing to say, it's different to say we want to close Roxham Road or we want to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement, and I agree with you. If you put up a fence, people will go around it. I want now to speak to the people from Acadie. I think Maître Abou Jaoudé will respond. Yes, I was listening to your colleague, Mr. Desbiens, in his presentation, and he said there were problems with the access to necessary tools, like access to services of a lawyer, but also certain basic services. Could you give us more details on this, please? Given the number of asylum seekers, there's pressure on the system, and this means that there are not enough lawyers in Quebec to look after all these asylum seekers. So access to justice is restricted. If we suspend the agreement, we think that asylum seekers would be more spread out throughout the country, and so they would have access to a lawyer, because this is what our association is. So a lawyer that could defend them, present their case, and help them. But it would also help with access to housing, to food, to different services, interpretation. So it would diminish the pressure on the Quebec system, and this would give a better access to asylum seekers. So some people say bad things about lawyers, but you have just shown that you want less clients. So money isn't the issue here. You want people to be able to use services of lawyers everywhere in Canada, so less work for immigration lawyers in Quebec. Am I right? I don't think it will diminish the number of clients for lawyers in Quebec in this situation, because right now we are unable to respond to the demand. I'm sorry, what I meant that if we suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement, there would be less pressure on Quebec. Sorry, I had a long day. So the pressure would be diffused over a larger area, so there would be less pressure on the legal system in Quebec. Yes, less pressure for the agency, for the board, and so it would be a better distribution of work. Thank you. Mr. Reichold, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Reichold. Yes, I've just been to Belgium. I listened to you carefully, and you did say that there was a humanitarian problem. I would like you to tell us more about this, because this is what we are looking at in this study, the humanitarian crisis for migrants. I think my colleague Franz André described the situation that he sees when he tries to help people. Right now, people are outside without coats, without clothes. They haven't had food sometimes for 3 days. And it's all concentrated around federal hotels, Saint-Laurent, Aunstic, Cartierville, and now it's moving towards La Petite Patrie and Villeray, other neighborhoods. So we're talking about around 1,000 people last week, and there were about 5,000 people in temporary housing Quebec and federal. They stay for 3 or 4 weeks, but once they leave this temporary housing, they have to fend for themselves. So they have to go and knock at different doors, but there are no doors left. And with a check for $150 per adult, they cannot find housing. You cannot feed children. And there's also an increase in the number of pregnant women who are not able to see a doctor. So I call this a humanitarian emergency. And governments should act responsibly and do as they do when there are natural disasters and put resources in place. I don't have much time left.
La session précédente.
In the previous session, an IRC representative is been involved for the past 4 years in these discussions about the agreement and was told that she didn't know what happened before the STCA was set up. So could you find it normal that someone who's participating in these negotiations doesn't even know how things went on before this agreement was put into place?
Well, I think what's important to note in this context, right, is what has led up to the agreement, right? And we know that there were concerns right from the beginning because the agreement went into effect in 2004, but in 2002 is when there were discussions.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up for Mr. Brunel Desabre. We will now proceed to
Merci
Ms. Kwan. Ms. Kwan, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I thank all the witnesses for their presentations. My question is to Ms. Silcoff. On the issue around the United States, whether or not it's a safe country for asylum seekers, many people will advance that it is a safe country. I'm very interested in knowing what has been presented in the legal case to indicate otherwise in the current situation as it stands. Why is it not safe for the asylum seekers?
Okay, again, I think it's really useful to look at the very specific categories or classes of people who are experiencing lack of safety and real serious deficiencies in the system, right? Because if the system doesn't function properly, people are at risk of refoulement. So it means that they would be sent back to the country of origin to experience further persecution. So I was trying to speak before about the 1 year bar, right? So for people who don't make an asylum claim right away, they can't enter into the asylum system, right? So, and there's lots of reasons people may not come forward because they're traumatized, because they're ashamed, because of cultural reasons. And so this particularly impacts gender-based claims, right? And so we know that people may not come forward with their claim. And then if they turn up at the border and they're rejected because of the STCA, then they really have a problem in the U.S. because then they're in a system where they can't access the U.S. asylum system, right? So that's another category. Also, people facing detention. So we know that Canada treats detention very differently from the U.S. In Canada, detention is seen, both according to the case law and the policies, as a last resort. The UNHCR specifies that people seeking protection should only be detained as a last resort. The United States sees detention very differently. They see it as an immigration management tool. This was exacerbated during the Trump administration, but it pre-existed the Trump administration, and it exists today. So when somebody is in jail in the U.S., they're experiencing very serious difficulties, and that's very different from Canada, right? So that's another category of people who are vulnerable.
Thank you. I want to get into about gender violence asylum seekers who are being rejected in the United States. So in those instances, if people were to try to make a claim in Canada and Canada turns them away, and then they will be deported back to their country of origin to face the violence to which they're trying to flee from. Is that not correct?
That's exactly correct. And so the example of the woman I gave who hung onto the back of the freight train, that was her dilemma, because she knew if she stayed in the United States, there was a strong likelihood that she would be deported to face renewed gender-based harm.
So on that basis, the Safe Third Country Agreement is actually putting people at further risk in terms of refoulement for Canada to apply deportation to such individuals. Canada is actually in violation of international law on refoulement. Is that not the case?
Right. So Canada is responsible for turning people back at the border. So Canada is not an innocent party in this. But
sorry for interrupting. I've stopped the clock. Okay. So many side conversations are going on. So, please, witnesses are here. Please provide them the opportunity to answer the questions. Please avoid side conversations. Thank you. Please.
Right. So I think when people are turned back from Canada, Canada does bear a responsibility, but we can do something about it, right? We can end the agreement, we could suspend it, but we can also look at the public policy discretionary exemptions that this committee was concerned about in 2002, that UNHCR was concerned about in 2002. And now is the time to take these seriously and have a real serious look at what we can do with them.
So would your first recommendation for this committee is for the Canadian government to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement in the very minimum or to get rid of it altogether? Short of that is to bring back those exemptions, the public policy exemptions under Article 6 to include gender-based claims, for example, and other vulnerable classes of people. Is that your recommendation?
Exactly. We have only one in place now for people facing the death penalty. It's rarely used. There was one for people from countries that Canada doesn't deport to. That's gone. But gender-based claims is a perfect example. People who would return to face jail in the United States simply because they want protection. That's another great example. People who are barred from the asylum system because they've passed the 1-year mark. That's another great example. So these are all discretionary public policy classes that Canada can put in place.
On the issue around people arriving and the delay in the processing, we just heard from the previous panel, people are not able to access what they call the brown paper document in a timely fashion as a result. They're living in poverty. They have to go and apply for income assistance. What do you think the Canadian government should do in the processing? Should they actually be issuing the brown paper document on arrival for individuals so that they can access all the services that come with that very important document?
I think we have to look at the reality of the situation, right? And I think we know that Budget 2022 put in place $1.3 billion for CBSA, IRCC, and the IRB. So there's finances there available for resources, and I think people shouldn't be suffering. People should be getting access to settlement resources as soon as possible.
I want to ask the same question to Mr. Vincent Desbiens, I hope I said that correctly, about the brown paper document. Should the government be issuing that on arrival so that people can actually seek the kind of support that they need to survive and then to look for employment?
Sorry, I'm going to take over. So yes, we think it should be delivered as soon as possible. And another way of doing it is having a, sorry, I'm hearing some echo. Okay, and another way of doing it is also doing a point for IRCC where claimant could go right away because
for interrupting time is, sorry for interrupting, time is up for Ms. Kwan. With that, our panel comes to an end. I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing before the committee today. Thanks a lot for your important testimonies. Like if there is something you would like to bring it to committee's attention, you can always send written submissions to the clerk of the committee, which will be circulated to all the members, and we will consider it when we come to the drafting stage. So with that, we will suspend this meeting, and all those members of the parliament who are doing this meeting virtually, they will have to log off and then log into the in-camera meeting for our committee business. So this meeting comes to an end. All the witnesses can leave the meeting, and all the members of parliament, please log off and then log in for the in-camera portion, and we will have a few minutes for the committee business. So the meeting is suspended.